like I said, a lot of notes today. I do apologize, but that is what we're doing. If you remember last time, we left off talking about NATO. We also talked about the Warsaw Pact. Basically, this idea of like, you fight my guy and you're getting jumped by all these other guys, right? Today, we're going to talk about a lot of different things involving the technology race. We'll talk about the space race. So your shirt works perfectly. Astronaut hat, right? It'll be a perfect tie-in to what we're going to talk about today a little bit. Talk about the arms race. Talk about Eisenhower. A couple other things. Let me see. Talk about McCarthyism. So did I show you guys the Twilight Zone episode where it's monsters on Marbury Street? I can't even say it.
Is it the one where all the power starts going?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, of course. I got some up here. Did I show you guys that one? Yeah. So that one's really, really solid, just to show you like what a lot of this Red Scare, witch hunt type of stuff is like. I don't know if they even intended that when they made that episode. It seems very close to like the reality of the situation, so maybe they did. Either way, think about that when you think about McCarthyism when we talk about that today. Additionally, we have the arms race, always fun to talk about. Talk about brinksmanship. We will talk about mutually assured destruction. That sounds fun, right? Some political cartoons. Talk a little bit about the the CIA, not the Soviet IA, the CIA, and the space race in general. I don't know why. I know that there's Cold War reasons for things like, why we're going to space, and there's Cold War reasons for, things like, there's military reasons for a lot of this stuff, getting satellites and all this. I don't know why. It always makes me kind of chuckle still that we're like in the middle of the Cold War, and then they're like, let's send a dog to space, right? Or something like that. So, yes. Yes, I do. You want a pen or a pencil? Okay.
Well, during the space race, the military did that to make sure that humans won't like instantly implode or anything.
Yeah, and then you also have like the whole Soviet satellite system, and you're like, all right, what are they looking at with this whole satellite thing? And yeah, but yeah, with the dogs to space, obviously you're testing that, but it's also kind of funny to think that they're like, load her up, right? Where this is what we're doing. So either way, we'll talk a little bit about that today. So it's kind of fun discussion on some of those things. We'll see some cool videos, I think, especially if we have time to get to them. Old videos. It's always also weird to look back at that time period and be like, they're doing this in like the 60s. And it's like, what? It's just weird. It's a weird kind of crazy thing. It feels like out of the range of technology during that time, but somehow, it wasn't. So you guys are going to learn about the arms race, space race, NASA, Sputnik, Neil Armstrong, the education race, science and math, CIA, all these different things we're going to talk about, and just kind of the battle between all these things. With all of this stuff happening, there's many arguments that you could probably make that like the Cold War was maybe a good thing in some ways. It definitely pushed us to innovate a lot more. And Soviet Union probably might not think the same way, considering they don't exist anymore. But either way, there's a lot of stuff that you can see here and think, there's some positive outcomes on a lot of these things. Nuclear weapons, maybe not one of those. Why is there so much competition between the U.S. and USSR? Well, you can probably guess, it's all about who can be better, who can be more powerful, who's going to take over that kind of superpower position in the world, especially following World War II. Who's going to be that centralized world power? So, election of 1952, they lost a lot of confidence in Truman's war policies, his foreign war policies to be specific. They're like looking at the Cold War and they're like, all right, I don't think this is really working out in our favor. If you remember the satellite countries, you see that communism is spreading relatively rapidly. Containment isn't working out as well as it probably could have. It looks like the U.S. is losing a lot of ground, okay? By this point, the Soviet Union tested an atomic bomb, so that's bad news, right? Also, they have a really, really good hold on Eastern Europe. China's falling to communism during this time. American troops are fighting in Korea. Truman is also just like, I think I'm just going to peace out, right? He's like, I'm not running for another term. I don't think this is going to work out for me. Might as well just, I don't even want to say quit while I'm ahead, but at least he, was involved in the ending of World War II. So he does have that going on. His approval ratings aren't really high. So he knows that, going up against, the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate, Dwight D. Eisenhower. One of those names you recognize, the other one you don't. That's probably because Dwight won, right? And he won very handedly. Dwight is involved in, D-Day, Operation Overlord, all that stuff. Very high-ranking military official. He's got a lot of political sway. He's well known by a lot of the American people. They're also going to look at Dwight and be like, okay, this guy was literally in D-Day. He's a war hero. Nationalism is still at an all-time high. Your place in the military is still very, very influential. So Eisenhower wins this election very, very handedly, very easily, I might add. It's like a landslide, pretty much. He comes through and he says, I have all of these initiatives. He's like, Truman's not really doing enough on the Cold War. Eisenhower, military guy, he's coming in. He wants to lay the hammer down, right? He wants to come in and he's got a couple ideas. First off, he wants to push for more power within the CIA. He bolsters their ability to conduct secret operations. This involves a bunch of things like infiltrating and overthrowing governments and like all over the world, right? The CIA is involved in a lot of that stuff. The International Atomic Energy Agency. So this is maybe something that, again, there are proponents for nuclear energy. There are opponents to nuclear energy. Wherever you lie on the spectrum, this is one of those things where it's more like Eisenhower saying, we need to also use atomic energy for peaceful means. He's saying there's different things that you could do, nuclear power plants. There's ways to use nuclear energy without it being channeled into an atomic bomb. So he's pushing for maybe an alternative use of nuclear energy there. That being said, you still have issues with nuclear energy plants and things like that. You'll see with Chernobyl. You'll see with nuclear waste. So there's definitely much to be said about that. Though it is also 1957, we're about 12 or 13 years removed from creating the bomb. There's probably still a lot to be discovered there and a lot that they don't quite understand. Eisenhower also wants to do this Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. It's a defense alliance against the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. It's much like the Truman Doctrine. If you remember, the Truman Doctrine is basically stopping that spread of communism in Greece and Turkey. It's kind of like the same thing, right? It's meant to curb the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. And also, on top of that, he creates NASA, right? So he comes in 1958, we create NASA, and that is to join the space-related efforts of American scientists and the military. It's also in response to Russian, innovation in the space field, kind of going to space and creating all these different satellites. So that is kind of it's more of a response than anything else. We look at that and we're like, well, we can't let Russia do everything, so we got to get involved as well. As far as this goes, more of Eisenhower's initiatives. He has, containing communism again. Nothing really changes with the ideas of containing communism between Eisenhower and Truman. Eisenhower, on the other hand, just wants to be more heavy-handed with it. You'll see that he starts using the threat of nuclear war a lot more, which becomes kind of a downside to some of his presidency. And many of the American citizens during the time would agree that they're not really huge fans of that, but it does work. It especially works when you're able to threaten nuclear war against countries who don't have a nuclear weapon yet. Doing that against Russia would kind of be like, okay, right? Us too then, right? And that's kind of the idea there. He creates containing, so this House of Un-American Activity Committee, this is going to be important in talking about our ideas with like McCarthyism, okay? It's a House of Representatives committee. They're meant to investigate citizens, employees, organizations for communist activities. You can probably already see where this is going. If you know anything about the Red Scare, if you know anything about communism on the home front, you probably know that this is going to end up wrongfully accusing a large amount of people. Oftentimes, this is called a witch hunt. The same thing with McCarthyism and Senator McCarthy himself. Witch hunts, coming from the idea of the Salem witch hunt, right? Pointing a finger at whoever, and you're like, they're a witch, and then all of a sudden they're getting, persecuted. Same thing happens here. You don't like Ted from The Office? Well, Ted's a communist, right? And now you look more loyal than anything else. And that's kind of one of those bad ideas and kind of attitudes that pops up during this time. People get blacklisted, which means basically being put on a watch list. That means that they're suspected of communist activities. So you don't want to get blacklisted during this time. You might be under surveillance. Every little move that you make might be being watched by somebody, whoever it might be. government agencies, your fellow workers, government employees, the CIA, whoever, right? They'll be watching you, and you're going to be, tiptoeing around a lot of things. Even if you're not guilty, it doesn't matter because you're gonna run into a lot of really suspicious people during this time, right? Any little thing that you do might be seen as a communist activity, right? You got to watch what you say. You got to watch how you act because you might be blacklisted. That leads us to this guy, Joe McCarthy. He's this Wisconsin senator. He used this idea of Red Scare, right? The Red Scare to get reelected. So he uses it as like a political tool, right? Pretty much. I'm Joe McCarthy, and I'm going to root out communism in the American government. In fact, he says, I have a list of 205 known communists. And then later on, people are like, all right, Joe, show us the list. And he's like, all right, well, maybe it's more like 57. Weird number. But then they're like, all right, whatever, just show us the 57 then. And Joe's like, okay, more like 9. And then eventually, it kind of comes out that Joe doesn't really have a list, and he doesn't really know of any of these, communist infiltrations in the country. Instead, he's just encouraging a widespread fear of communism. He's using it for his own political gain. He knows that doing all these things is getting him reelected. It's gaining him support. People are like, yeah, go Joe, root out the communism. He's like, I'm going to do it. Just kidding, right? And then he doesn't. Instead, he kind of makes himself look like a dummy in a lot of this situation because, eventually he's forcing government officials to testify about communist allegations and influences. He's, creating a lot of fear in the country and in government itself. People are worried. He becomes very powerful, right? But only for a short amount of time, genuinely. He becomes very powerful out of the use of fear. People didn't want to be a victim of his badgering. They might go along with some of this stuff just so that they don't have to worry about Joe being like, well, Senator so-and-so is a communist, and then everybody's got to deal with that backlash, right? With that, eventually, in 1954, McCarthy is censured, which is pretty much like this form of formal disapproval. There's a recent censure in our own politics as well, current politics. It's one of the more serious criticisms that the Senate can level against a member. It's basically just like a formally like, we're not really approving of anything that you're doing. It's also kind of like outcasting that senator to some extent. After his censure, McCarthy loses all of his influence. He ends up dying in 1957. I don't know if this was the only thing keeping him going. But, he doesn't get reelected. He loses all that influence. He just becomes kind of a joke, right, more than anything else. But that is not to be confused with the fact that McCarthy was incredibly powerful for a certain amount of time. And he did definitely bolster this sense of fear of communism infiltrating the American government, infiltrating the American way of life. And this is a big kind of thing that you see around the time. If you remember in the Twilight Zone episode that we watched where they think it's all aliens, I told you guys, I think I said at least, replace aliens with communists and look at that again. Watch the same episode again. You have people walking around going, well, why are your lights on? What's going on there? Why does your car start? They're all suspicious of each other. They're all paranoid. And then what happens in the end? Do you guys remember?
I gotta get shot.
Yeah, somebody gets shot, and then what happens? Chaos, right? Chaos ensues. That's what's going on here, is straight chaos during this time. Well, you're a communist. And then what? Remember, what happens to the guy when he's like, the guy who shoots the other guy, and they're like, well, why'd you do it? And he's like, well, I'm not the communist or whatever. I'm not the alien. I know who is, right? And who's he playing? Anybody remember? The little kid, right? He's like, I didn't do it, but I know who did it. And that's kind of the same attitude that's happening during this time. I'm not the communist, but I know who the communist is. So people are getting, painted for these different allegations, and they're like, well, it's not me, it's that guy. And they do it to prove their loyalty, and that just leads to a whole lot more chaos. McCarthyism becomes known as this tactic of damaging reputations with, vague and unfounded charges. It's basically claiming somebody is something without having evidence to back it up. It's like if you guys went to the principal and you're like, hey, Mr. Doff is a murderer, all right? And the principal's like, okay, where's your evidence? And you're like, just trust me, right? It's the same idea here. Or if you called me a communist, it still probably wouldn't look good nowadays even. Some things to understand. Eisenhower's Cold War initiatives, we went over some of those. Remember CIA, a lot of communism containment in Southeast Asia. Creating NASA, right, is obviously a big one. There's plenty of different things to look at there. What is McCarthyism? Again, McCarthyism is basically this tactic for damaging reputations with unfounded, charges, no evidence, but, you are doing serious damage there. And then what is blacklisting, right? Blacklisting, again, is like putting somebody on a watch list, okay? You've been blacklisted. You are now watched by the government or whoever, CIA, whoever might be watching you for suspicious activity. It's basically, the whole point of all of this is just to paint the picture of that, there's a lot of tension, there's a lot of paranoia, there's a lot of fear during this time. It's kind of, an issue of imploding more than anything else. Not a lot of unity, right? There's a lot of separation and division. Now, the fun part, looking at the arms race. So I can fix this stupid mask. Looking at the arms race, the U.S. and USSR are in competition for the most powerful weapon technology. Again, you get to the point where the U.S. has nuclear weapons, USSR has nuclear weapons, and you run into these things of like who can have the most and who can have the best. And there's kind of two sides to the story. We have massive retaliation, right? This is the policy that threatened to use nuclear war, okay? Eisenhower decreased the size of the army, and he increased the funding for nuclear weapons. He's basically saying, like, the army is not really giving us as much as nuclear weapons are. He also understands that the United States economy needs to cut some costs in some areas so that we don't become susceptible to communism. If our economy starts tanking, the worry is that if we end up kind of being a poor nation, that we're going to be more susceptible to a lot of these ideas. Eisenhower also famously said that nuclear weapons gave more bang for the buck. So that's where he shifted his focus. He's like, this is probably the smarter place for me to spend my money. Also, the Soviets are doing it, so let's go ahead and match them on that front.
I still don't understand why they had to make a few thousand atomic bombs.
There's even
hundred
more
can destroy a country.
Yeah, there's even more. We'll take a list, like a look at a list, and man, it's more than a few thousand even. And I agree in some of the same ways. That's why I think it gets back to the aspect of like, who's got more, right? It's a big, flexing contest in some ways. Who's got the stronger muscles? And it becomes a race, right? Of who has the biggest arsenal, who has the most powerful weapons. The USSR, they developed some pretty powerful nuclear weapons. I think. Yeah. Did we take a look at that in this class at all?
I don't know if we have.
Well, I did. There's a website called NukeMap that you can do, and on that website you can straight up drop the bomb somewhere. So we dropped one on Indianapolis, okay, and we used the SAR bomb, the second one, the biggest one that they ever created. And even if you drop that bomb on Indianapolis, in where we're at here in Bloomington right now, that bomb is so powerful that you and I, if we were in direct probably view of the blast, we would have third-degree burns. All the way in Indianapolis, all the way out here to Bloomington. That's an hour drive. It's kind of crazy. And this was like I said, this is like Lucas Oil. I think I dropped it on. I felt pretty powerful. Can't lie.
The SAR bomb we made one in the 60s or something.
I don't remember. And so imagine, I don't even know
that
what
was like back in the 60s. Imagine if we made it even more powerful.
I would imagine that we as civilians don't know what the most powerful bomb is my guess. Looking at this, the Soviet, what's up?
Could you go back?
Yeah, no problem. So the Soviet Union, the next thing that we'll talk about is the fact that they basically, they test and they have their first successful test and launching of an atomic weapon in 1949. This is going to make the Soviet Union the second nation to ever detonate a nuclear device, which also subsequently puts them on a very equal playing field to the United States. It's actually really impressive. Obviously, we talked a little bit about the Rosenbergs. We talked about some of the espionage going on during the time. They were able to steal our atomic secrets and figure out how to make the bomb themselves. I'm sure that they would have figured it out eventually, but that obviously fast-tracked a lot of the things there, and that's what they're kind of most concerned with, is getting on that equal playing field, because so long as they don't have the bomb, we have an upper hand, right? When they do get the bomb, we run into those ideas of mutually assured destruction, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. This is just a kind of a newspaper outlining it. Russia has atomic bomb. Everybody's freaking out here, right? The U.S. learns of recent explosion. The president discloses it. This would be big news at the time, for sure. Absolutely would be big news at the time. They say Pentagon shows excitement. Details on blasts in USSR not revealed. Some people are urging a pact. The U.S. still ahead of Russians, right? You see that with the whole kind of arms race idea here. We're still ahead of them. We're still number one, right? And that's kind of a big, a big theme during this time. Talking about and this I don't even know if I don't know how up to date this is. It's just kind of the material that I'm working with. But you see, 1945, 6 atomic bombs. Okay, 6 nuclear weapons. Nobody else, right? We're number one. Yay, USA, right? Then, obviously we're making a ton already. 369 feels like a lot anyway. The Soviets come around 1950, so this is about a year after they have their first test. They have 5, all right? Now it becomes a race of who can build the biggest arsenal. We see that. And from 1950 to 1955, we go from 369 to 3,057 nuclear weapons. Obviously, we're still showing like a good proficiency in developing these. We're probably a lot better at it than the Russians are, at least to begin. But as things carry on, you see big numbers happening. I mean, look at this. 5 to 200, 200 to 1,600, but 3,000 to 20,000, and then 20,000 to 31,000. And a lot of this does get at kind of Dwight Eisenhower's initiatives, his focuses. We're putting a lot of money towards this, and Eisenhower, again, famously said, more bang for our buck. Let's have as many nukes as we can, right? And again, this is kind of like a big kind of flexing competition. You also have Britain kind of developing some of these things as well. France, China eventually gets one, which is going to be a big thing in the grand scheme of things. So the fact that China doesn't have their nuclear weapon until 1965 is going to play a role in some of the things that Eisenhower says to a place like China when they're doing things like invading neighboring countries or they're trying to spread communism on their own fronts. That gets us into this idea of brinksmanship. Okay, so brinksmanship is the willingness to go to the brink of war to force the other side to back down. It's basically the willingness for you to play a strong game of chicken, right? It's like if you had 2 semis driving at each other, each one's going 90 miles per hour, who's going to back out first, right? Or are you both just going to crash into each other and burn, okay? That's kind of the idea here. Many Americans are worried about Eisenhower's willingness to go to the brink of war by threatening nuclear war. They're like, man, this guy might be a little crazy, right? They're like, he's really out here just telling them, like, we will nuke you, right? And he's saying some of those things to some of these countries. A lot of Americans are a little bit worried about it. Eisenhower ends the Korean War by implying an impending nuclear attack. Obviously, the story might be different if that country had nuclear capabilities at the time, but it ends up working out pretty well. So people are worried about it. He's using all these tactics, and he's saying some pretty crazy things, but it's working. So, yeah.
I think I read something about how Eisenhower secretly tried to do a document or something that allowed him to nuke Korea.
That would not surprise me.
But luckily, I forget his name or something. But one of the main people that looked into the documents managed to find it because he was trying to make it
talk about it.
But he found it and then denied it.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me given the context of some of the actions that Eisenhower's taking during this time. You also got to remember, I mean, he's an old-fashioned military guy. Eisenhower has no problem with military action whatsoever. Eisenhower also threatens nuclear war with China when they have plans to take Taiwan. The U.S. really, really wanted Taiwan to stay anti-communist because it's again kind of the same idea with Turkey. The worry is that those buffer countries, those border countries, once one of them falls, the rest fall like dominoes, and we see that with Vietnam and our worries there. China is like, all right, dude, fine, don't nuke us, okay? This might have changed a little bit if it was a little bit later, when a lot of that stuff is happening and China is finally having those nuclear capabilities. But at the time, it's kind of who's got the bigger gun, right? This also gets us at the idea of mutually assured destruction. For example, with this, talk about the Suez Canal, right? So in 1956, the U.S. is trying to gain popularity in the Middle East. They don't want the Arab nations to start forming alliances with the Soviets. They don't want communism to spread in the Middle East either. France and Britain invade Egypt after the Egyptians seized the Suez Canal from the French, so we have some allied issues going on there. Maybe this gets a little bit back at that pact that they made. France is like, hey, we got your back. Or, Britain's like, we got your back. The Soviet Union came to Egypt's defense threatening nuclear rocket attacks, so we have a lot of tension again. Eisenhower puts nuclear forces on alert in the U.S., claiming if those fellows start something, we may have to hit them, and if necessary, with everything in the bucket. So if we took a look at a lot of those nuclear weapons that are being developed at the time, Eisenhower's basically saying, like, if something starts, it's going to pop off, right? And we have plenty of nuclear weapons to throw at you, so maybe you don't want to do that. It's kind of the thought process there. So with this mutually assured destruction, one of the things I think I may have touched on with you guys last class is that, mutually assured destruction and this idea of, like, if one person launches a nuke, then we're all launching our nukes, and it's just going to be, there's going to be hell to pay in many different ways, right? This is also kind of a form of deterrence, though. Same thing with some of those pacts. People know that you don't want to start a nuclear war because it's not going to end well for anybody. So the fact that that is a thing, and the fact that other countries start to develop these weapons, probably overall makes it way less likely that we're going to use a nuke in the first place. If a lot of these tensions kept going forward and it's 1965 or something and the US has a nuclear weapon and nobody else does, there's probably, a heavier chance that maybe something's going to get launched or somebody's going to finally press that button. But if you know that if you press that button, you yourself are going to get annihilated, then you're probably not going to press that button. Does that make sense? It's just a kind of an idea of deterrence there. So it increases tension, but it also maybe, in a weird way, increases safety and cautiousness. Who knows? So we got a political cartoon here. What do you guys see? Yeah, I know we haven't talked about this guy too much, but you probably know him. Any idea? What do you see here? What are some things you pick up?
In an arm wrestle.
Yeah.
Rushing.
What do you think that maybe symbolizes?
The arms race.
Yeah, maybe the arms race, right? If you're getting kind of like cheeky with it, right? Or it could also, if you're getting like super just vague with it, it's just like who's stronger, right? It's a battle of who's stronger. But yeah, I think arms race is probably even better for that.
Oh, I didn't even notice he's got his hand over that other guy's long button.
Yeah. What do you think with that? What's the idea there? Think about what we just talked about. Mutually assured destruction, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So who do you think wrote or created this? Somebody in Russia or somebody in the U.S.?
U.S.
Probably the U.S., right? Because what are some other things that you see on this?
Russia's struggling.
Yeah, he's struggling, right? He's got the old cartoon sweat coming out. He's sweating beads. No, Kennedy's sweating a little bit too, but he's showing resolve, right? He looks strong. This guy looks scared and nervous. So you can guess that this is probably something, created in the U.S. It's a form of like political cartoons or maybe even propaganda, but it also gets at the idea of like, hey, I'll blow you up. And he on the other side has his finger on that bomb trigger for Kennedy's bomb. So it gets at the idea of mutually assured destruction, right? I press your button, you're done. You press my button, I'm done. So nobody really wins here. So we talked about mutually assured destruction, brinksmanship. What was the arms race? What is McCarthyism? Does anybody have any questions on any of those things? Any confusion on any of that at all? Okay. Remember, this is like playing a game of chicken. This is basically, it is what it is in the name, mutually assured destruction. What is the arms race? They're race to see who can have the best and most bombs, essentially, and weapons and arsenals. What is McCarthyism? That is getting at the idea of Red Scare and basically slandering people and pointing fingers with no evidence.
Wait, do you know the old Mad comics?
Yes.
Is that where that comes from?
I don't think so. No. But I remember, do you remember what MAD stands for? I don't remember it. I just remember the kid on the front of those comics always gave me like nightmares. He freaks me out. What do we see in this? What do we see in this one here? Might be hard to read some of those papers that are floating in the middle, but what do you guys think this is depicting? Any idea?
The two countries animals fighting.
Yeah, right. It seems to be that oftentimes, even today and back then, Russia's kind of represented by this big bear, right? The Ruski bear. And then the U.S. obviously is represented by the bald eagle many times. There's a division, right? There's a divide between them. We're both staring at each other. They both look pretty menacing. This is probably one that's relatively in between in terms of bias as opposed to the last one. And these papers that are floating through the center, one of them says irresponsible statements. The other one says deepening suspicion. So this is probably somebody creating this in the vein of like, what are you both doing, essentially? There's irresponsible statements being made, things about like, we'll nuke you, right? Deepening suspicions, worries about maybe McCarthyism on the home front, worries about the spread of communism and what the other country has going on. We're suspicious of the Russians and the Russians are suspicious of us. It looks like this would be a pretty crazy battle to see, I would imagine. A giant bald eagle and a bear. I don't know. I'd like to see it. What about you guys? Sounds kind of cool. Who knows? Okay. So we got a couple more things. I think that we'll get through all this stuff today. So we should have maybe a little bit of time to, yeah, we're almost done. So we'll do CIA operations. We'll talk about Eisenhower's doctrine a little bit. After that, we will get to the space race, and we'll kind of finish off with some interesting clips involving that. With the CIA, our favorite governmental agency, the one that's always depicted as being like, very covert, very spy-oriented. They are conducting hidden operations to stop developing nations from becoming communist in places like Iran, places like Guatemala. The CIA is working to overthrow anti-American leaders and replace them with pro-American leaders. Now, obviously, what you define as anti-American probably changes throughout the years. What they're really looking at here is, how can we stop the spread of communism? Sometimes and many times through means that are probably not very, I don't know how to put it. Practical, maybe, yeah. So things like literally overthrowing governments and putting their own kind of infiltrations here. It's a little funny during the time we're so worried about somebody overthrowing our own government, and here we are ourselves going over and overthrowing other governments, obviously, with the sole purpose of making sure that communism doesn't spread, with making sure that capitalist nations are maybe in place, that democratic institutions are more in place over time. And it also doesn't help that many of these developing nations don't like the European countries. They don't like European imperialism. They don't like American capitalism. They blame it for a lot of their problems. They also kind of look at the Soviet Union as like a model. They're like, hey, Soviet Union's got it figured out. So we're really, really worried about a lot of these countries during this time, especially with the Red Scare and how we think about the way that communism spreads and how communism is viewed by a lot of capitalist countries. We're looking at this and we're like, man, what can we do to make sure that that doesn't happen? So that's where the CIA kind of comes into place. So you have all these countries looking at the Soviet Union and we're like, man, I hope that they don't, go on and kind of follow suit. The worries are happening in the U.S. kind of all over the place, and that kind of brings us to the Eisenhower Doctrine. This is really, really kind of a similar thing compared to the Truman Doctrine. Again, I mentioned it before, but if you remember, in the Truman Doctrine, we are, helping in Greece, we're helping in Turkey, we're trying to make sure that we stop these communist revolutions, we're trying to make sure that we stop any sort of communist expansion. The same thing is happening here with the Eisenhower Doctrine, but more so in Northern Africa and the Middle East. What you see is that in 1957, President Nasser of Egypt begins spreading the idea of Pan-Arabism. It's basically an idea that would unite all Arab nations, right? So he's looking at this and he's like, well, maybe we should stick together. We got a lot of things in common. A lot of ideologies are the same out here. And this starts to worry the U.S. Again, they're looking at this and they're like, well, if you guys are really sympathetic to the Soviet cause, if one of you goes, then that's going to just strengthen the idea that if one person turns communist, then every country is going to turn communist. So, of course, as the U.S. does, thinking the idea is going to spread, they put forces in Jordan and Lebanon until they can stabilize the situation, doing whatever they might do with their covert operations, destabilizing governments in other ways, and kind of putting things in motion. 1953, Stalin passes away. He has a massive heart attack. And this guy, Nikita Khrushchev, becomes the head of the Communist Party. This is going to be, yes. Yeah, of course. Yeah. So this guy's going to become the head of the Communist Party. A lot of these things, it's interesting to see how changes in leadership happen throughout the Cold War. Things like this are definitely going to lead to more tension, but sometimes it leads to more communication. Sometimes different leadership styles prevail in different ways. As you saw, FDR is in the middle of all those talks about what we're going to do with post-war Europe. FDR passes away and they got to switch to Truman. Same thing's happening here. Truman's gone and now it's Eisenhower. And so it's interesting to see how each different president and each different leader is going to handle the situation. You have changes in power and things do change over time, and that could lead to more tension, again, like I said, or maybe in some cases lead to better communication. Maybe some leaders kind of get along better than others and they kind of figure things out, but at the same time, it could also be devastating. So this is going to be a time where, what do we think? What do we think about Nikita Khrushchev? Like, is he going to be somebody who's going to be a little bit easier to deal with? Is he going to be worse to deal with? This is probably something that a lot of people in the American government are thinking about during this time, especially
Eisenhower. Why the USSR broke apart?
I don't remember exactly. I do know that he plays a pretty significant role in some of the things that are going to come up that we're going to talk about, like next class. It's pretty crazy, especially like the Cuban Missile Crisis and all these different things. Looking at that, I don't want to get too far into it just because it's a really interesting story to talk about. But some people would argue that if you didn't have, those two sides with Kennedy and, Khrushchev, if you didn't have those two talking to each other and you had any other leader, something might have gone very bad. So there are things to say about it, but yeah, I don't know. I have to look into that. I'm not sure. We have the space race, fun stuff here. This is the race between the U.S. and the USSR to be the first in space. 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. 1958, the U.S. is like, all right, we see you. We should probably get on this too. So Eisenhower's like, boom, we just created NASA, all right? And lo and behold, NASA's still around today doing a bunch of crazy stuff. The big worry here is that the satellites will help the Soviet communication and spying on their nations. That's a huge deal. They're like, if you get back to the idea of espionage, they're like, all right, well, now we got some sort of satellite up in space. Like, what are they looking at? What are they doing? What are they communicating with? How is this going to help them with their spread of communism? So we're like, well, we got to get to space as well. Sputnik 2 was launched 1 month after Sputnik, carried the first living creature into orbit. It was a dog. The dog did not make it. The dog did make it like 3 rotations, but after the 4th orbit, it was found that the dog wasn't really showing any vital signs. But still, this is something that's actually kept secret until like the 21st century, probably because the Soviets didn't want it. It probably made them look a little bad. Not that they killed the dog or anything like that, but more that it wasn't entirely successful the way that they were probably hoping for, right? So that does happen. Soviets have that whole thing, and they kind of keep it secret, but it's probably seen as more of a success at the time because they're telling everybody, hey, we just put the first living thing into space, and it went great, and that's something to keep in mind. We have this short little graph here. Ironically, it's not short at all, actually. There's the USSR, USA, USSR, USA, USSR, so on and so forth. Let's say AT&T. Yeah, first active communication satellite. Shout out to AT&T. USSR, NASA, USSR, NASA. You have Apollo 11, Apollo 8, Gemini 8, all these different things. The whole reason to show you this is just to show you that, like, there is a lot of action going on right now. And, if you look, it's 57, 58, 59, 59, 59, 52, or sorry, 50, 61, 62, 63. This is all happening in succession. It's like the Soviets do something and we're like, one up them. And the Soviets are like, they just did that. We got to do this. And it's back and forth the whole way. You have the first satellite, Sputnik 1. That's going to be seen right there. You have that going on. That's the USSR. You got the first living animal in space with Sputnik 2. Again, the USSR. You have the first man in space, Yuri, our guy right there, USSR. Okay. You have the first woman, Valentina Tereshkova. She is also involved with the USSR. You can probably guess from her name. Very Russian names here, Yuri and Valentina. Basically, the USSR has beaten us heavily in the very beginning. They're just beating us down. They got the first man in space, the first woman, the first dog, right? All these different things. And the U.S. is like, wow, we're really losing a lot of momentum here. The U.S. ends up, having the first full Earth photo. That's a pretty big deal. 1972, we have this photo called the Blue Marble, right? Obviously, that we put the first man on the moon eventually with Neil. So we do have a bunch of things that are kind of going back and forth, and we're like, who can one up the other one? It's again a big deal of like who's flexing harder on the other person. Let's take a look at a video here. So this is the first footage taken in space. Let me go ahead and make sure that I'm sharing this with you guys. I don't know if it even has any volume. I got it. I can't even imagine, you know, it's weird enough for me to imagine going to space now in the year 2021. I don't think I'd ever be able to do it. I'm too afraid of vast open space like that. But imagine doing it in like 59 and like 55 and all this other stuff. It's crazy.
The process and power that Apollo 11 had was actually less than 1 gigabyte.
That's crazy. That's insane. And to think that it, you know, we're able to send stuff like that to space is absurd. Obviously, as you can see, very early footage, you're going to look at this and be like, what is that? Did somebody record that with their toaster? I don't know. But, you know, get away from your 2021 mindset. Think of it in the mindset of somebody back in 59, and that's something purely incredible to see. At this point, you had never seen yourself from the outside looking in, right? Nowadays, I can look up Earth. I can go on Google Earth. People back then, they're not thinking about Google Earth during this time.
I don't even think that was digital, like, at all. I think that was a film.
Probably not. Yeah, that was probably film. Yeah. So let's see what we got next. I know we got another one here.
Grammarly can help.
Oh my gosh, Grammarly. This is the Apollo space program. Make sure I share this with you guys. This sentence may sound grammatically correct, but it's wordy.
Plus 0, 0, 0, 9 or 8. Plus, correction, 0, 0, 5, 7, 2. Cherokee, plus 0, 0, 0, 8, 5. 0, 0, 7, 6, 4. 0, 3, 0. 0, 0, 0. 2, 9er, 3. 986 minus 0, 0, 7, 5, 9er.
Apollo went into orbit around the moon. The journey that had taken the lifetime of mankind was nearing its crucial moment.
Apollo 11, Houston, we wondered if you started into the lab yet, over. Okay, Charlie, we're at the lab. The docking index mark is the same. Roger, we copy.
The lunar module Eagle was again given a thorough checkout to ensure the functioning of all systems, as Armstrong and Aldrin prepared to seal themselves off from Collins in the command module and for the two craft to pull apart.
2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Houston out, over. Okay, let's go there. Captain on the hot fire. Okay, all flight controllers going around the horn. Gonna go for undocking. Okay, retro, go. Fido, go. Guide, go. Control, go. Telcom, go. Gypsy, go. Econ, go. Surgeon, go. Capcom, we're go for undocking. Eagle, Houston, we're standing by, over.
I can't even imagine how overwhelming all this
Houston, we
is.
take on the terrible, over.
Just like it.
Eagle, undock.
I would freak out.
I think a good 40%.
Roger, how is it look? Stay away.
Yeah, probably. Probably.
The Eagle has wings.
That and like G-force and all that other stuff.
On its own now, but with Columbia near at hand, it coasted around to the backside of the moon, and there, while out of direct communication with the Earth, it fired its engine to slow its descent to a touchdown on the near side of the moon. Collins in Columbia
Imagine getting out
continued in
and
orbit,
walk on the
awaiting their
moon,
return.
and then being like, we gotta get back in this thing and dock. We gotta dock and all this other stuff. There's no way I'd be able to do it.
go. Capcom, we're go for landing. Altitude 4,200. You're go for landing, over. Roger, understand. Go for landing. 3,000 feet.
They have to do it and then.
You're looking great.
Just in case if they like.
How you doing, Control? We're looking good here. Fine.
There's so much that could go wrong.
Even if you slip on a rock.
Roger.
On your back and you don't.
There's so much, and you just can't,
Still
you have
looking
to do
very good.
everything
You go.
perfectly.
Especially with the technology.
Yeah. Things change a little bit over time, even now, going out to
Roger,
space.
12
I mean,
alarm.
I'm smarter about it now, but
Okay,
I don't think I can
Where
do it.
go?
They,
Where
you
go?
said with the technology.
Altitude
It
1,600.
was an absolute.
Eagle looking great.
Yes.
Roger, 1202, we copy it. 35 degrees, 750, coming down to 23. 540
Imagine
feet
doing all that,
at a
just people
15.
be like, wait.
350 feet down at 4.
Funny, people that
Altitude,
don't
velocity light.
even have the technology to take that.
8 and a half down, 220 feet. 11 forward, coming down nicely, 200 feet. 4 and a half down, 5 and a half down. 100 feet, 3 and a half down, 9 forward. Okay, 75 feet. That's looking good, down a half. 6 forward. 60 seconds. Lights on, forward. Forward. 30 feet down, 2 and a half. Picking up some dust. Big shadow. 4 forward, drift into the right a little. 30 seconds forward, just. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. This is Apollo Control Houston at 105 hours down to the flight to Apollo 11. Yeah, our current plan is to have crew members aboard the Eagle to eat and relax for a little while prior to starting EVA prep, so we won't know with certainty or have a reasonable time pack until about an hour before the schedule.
街の通りにはかなり多くの人が見られますが、大多数の人はもちろんテレビを見られるホテルのロビーとか休憩室に集まっています。私たちは待っているので、pour la première fois, prennent pied sur la Lune. Les rues sont loin des villes, naturellement, mais naturellement aussi, c'est surtout dans les halls d'hôtels, les bars et les appartements que les gens se groupent, c'est-à-dire partout où ils peuvent trouver un récepteur de télévision. Et nous attendons tous.
Die Welt darauf wartet, dass ein Mensch zum ersten Mal den Mond
And the world waited. July 20th,
There are people alive
1969.
during this time who were alive during like the late 1800s.
It is said that 500 million people gathered at TV sets around the world to wait for the first Earthling to set
They're
foot on the
watching
moon.
people land on the moon.
Countless millions more listened on the
It's gotta be
radio
insane.
for voices from the moon.
And this Mayo radio check. Mayo, this is Houston, loud and clear. Great buzz.
Never before had so many people been attuned to one event at one time.
也都等待着人类首次登陆月球的当口。
The world waited, curious, wondering, aware,
Where?
like a sleeper wakened in the night by a faraway sound. A moment sensed, more than understood.
What? Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now. Neil, we can see you coming. Okay, I just checked, getting back up to that first step, that haven't collapsed too far, but, it's adequate to get back up. Roger, we copy. Pretty good little job. At the foot of the ladder, the lamp footbeds are only,
Neil Armstrong.
depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches, although the surface appears to be very, very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder. Down there, it's very fine. I'm going to step off the lamp. That's one small step for man,
One small step for man.
Wonder how long he was thinking of that one. Probably writing all the way out there. Small giant leaps and it doesn't sound right. Yeah, it's one small foot. Ah.
I think he wrote it down on the paper and
He's probably really nervous. I think it is.
Czasów przylądka Kennedy. Astronauta Neil Armstrong人類が月面に到着しました。ケープケネディ時間で4時17分。最後に今日は
It has a stark beauty all its own. It's like much of the high desert of the United States. It's different, but it's very pretty out here. Are you getting a TV picture now, Houston? Neil, yes, we are getting a TV picture. You're in our field of view now. Okay, ready to come out? All set. Okay, I'm on the top step. It's a very simple matter to hop down from one step to the next. You've got 3 more steps and then a long one. Okay, I'm going to leave that 1 foot up there and
It's amazing how cautious they're being getting off the ladder, you know. Anyways, all really interesting things. We'll finish off with a short discussion on this U2 incident. Not the band, not the same incident that we had with U2 sneaking their album onto all of our iPhones. Did anybody ever have that issue? Every single time when I would get in my car for the longest time, it would be like U2 would automatically start playing. It was driving me insane. I don't use the music app on my iPhone anymore.
The last Apple device I had was an iPod Touch back in 2010.
Well, I'm on the Spotify grind now, so I'm done with the Apple Music. I don't have enough money for that. I'm on that. I feel like Spotify's a lot more user friendly for me. Either way, so U2, the U2 incident, it's the Soviet Union, shooting down this American spy plane called the U2 plane. It's a really advanced plane for the time. It's the best spy plane that we had. Basically, it can fly really high. It can fly higher than any plane at the time. We probably thought we were going to get away with this one, to the point where Eisenhower doesn't apologize for, his idea of, protecting American security. On top of that, we also try to kind of cover it up. We're like, what? U2 spy plane? Never heard of it, right? That's kind of our response at first. And eventually it kind of comes out. We're like, all right, yeah, it was our spy plane. So, but we're not apologizing for it. Khrushchev is like, any more spy flights, and that's war. Okay, so you can see there's still a lot of tension here. There's a large amount of tension looming around this time, 1961. Eisenhower leaves office. He's done. He expressed his disappointment in the Cold War. He said that he wished he could say that there was going to be a lasting peace in sight. As we'll talk about next class, lasting peace is, of course, very far out of reach at this moment. So that is what we have for today. That is where we'll end everything off.
Mr. Dahl.
Yes.
We can't see your screen.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Here, give me 1 second. I forgot to go back.
Thank you.
Apologies. Yeah, of course. Here you go. So I'll leave that up there for you guys, and then let me present that. This is the last slide. So just the U2 incident, Soviet Union shooting down the American spy plane, and then the whole issue with Khrushchev saying that there will be more war. And then again, like I said, there's still a lot yet to come, right? So I think maybe next class, I don't know for sure. I haven't looked ahead too far, but I think we'll probably talk about Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that is you could spend hours on that in itself. I do encourage that maybe you look up some of that stuff if you've never seen anything about it. If it interests you, take a little bit of time to look it up, just because it is kind of it's probably the closest that we've ever come to just being annihilated. So that's always fun, right? All right.
I think Putin's found the secret to immortality. It's the same for like 20 years.
Yeah, right. It's all the bear fighting that he does.